Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Being the last speaker of the day gives you a dubious distinction. It also gives you the privilege of saying that, whatever I really needed to say has already been said, and I've been practicing this line all through the day, so I thought I will indulge and crack this on the podium. But my topic really is I've called it truth versus hype, media, hypernationalism, and impact on perceptions. The reason I chose this topic is I also have, I sort of come from a unique perspective in IDSA. Before my interest in research and pursuing research at IDSA, I also worked as a news anchor and correspondent covering foreign policy in one of the channels and networks which are often accused of being jingoistic and fanning hyper-nationalism in terms of coverage vis-a-vis foreign affairs. So that's where I'm coming from, and I hope a lot of my friends in the media tell me now that you've quickly slipped onto the other side, it's very easy for you to join the bandwagon and start media bashing. What I try and tell them is that possibly the breathing space that you get, being free of that 24-hour madness, allows you the slight space to be slightly self-critical. So with that, I'm going to start this presentation, and I thought this picture basically represented what the media in South Asia is trying to do, with the dominant discourse in South Asia really being of conflict. What each media, I feel, especially television, that's why sometimes it goes into hyperbole, is trying to legitimize their point of view or their opinion on a particular subject, and there is a constant tug of war on the issue. Now, if you'd indulge me, television journalists are often accused of being, as some of the speakers said today, we basically dumb down stories. So, and they're right, and a lot of times 30 seconds is not enough to convey the complexity of a debate. And so I'm going to try and tell you, how foreign affairs really finds itself on Indian prime time. This is really the ideal perception of the Indian neighborhood that you'll like to have on television every day. In fact, when the Prime Minister was being sworn in on May 26th, you had a lot of breathless reporting by English news anchors saying, well, the new regime is going to move relationships beyond the zero-sum game. But cut to August and September, tensions across the border, and we are now down to prime time, which looks like this. Let me assure you that these pictures are not, especially the one with Sushant was not done on purpose. But this is basically the reality of how prime time looks and its view of the neighborhood at 9 o'clock on most of the Indian news channels, which claim to be the most watched news networks in India. So, giving you this background, there are a couple of things that, we've spoken about. Mr. Dikshit has spoken about this earlier in the morning, and so has Smriti, as to, how are we really looking at foreign policy coverage in South Asia? I would really try and isolate this because I'm speaking about television here and say that, well, there is a lot of issues we need to tackle. Number one, because of the context in which we are talking about, can media coverage, especially populist mass media coverage of South Asia, actually frame a discourse which is outside or independent of the national discourse in the country? When do lines blur between jingoism and national interest? How do we sort of define that? A lot of talk has happened about the commercial aspects impinging on news. They are very much a reality, and Mr. Sharma has already alluded to the fact that, we, both television and print in India, hardly carry any subscription fee. So if one has to reduce the dependence on advertising and therefore the vicious cycle with the TRP, how and when is that going to happen? Also, sometimes this was taken up in the last session about this overestimation of media influence on foreign policy. These are some of the issues I hope to navigate with this paper in our discussions ahead. I have done a little bit of work on media and its impact on foreign policy in a monograph I did for IDSA called Who Sets the Agenda? Does Primetime Pace Policy? And some of the theoretical conceptualization comes from there. But I don't want to dwell on that for too long because I really want to punctuate the next 10 minutes I have with you, with a couple of anecdotes to really show you how media's agency in the neighborhood is seen. But however, the couple of trends is, of course, when there's a spectacle, that's when foreign affairs suddenly jumps into prime time view. You need a crisis, the coverage is negative, it's largely sustained, it drives public opinion. And sometimes when the government is seen as not having policy clarity, that's when influence really becomes more apparent. But there's also the flip side to it. A lot of foreign policy coverage is driven by the public interest in those countries specifically, and we'll see that in some of the slides I plan to present ahead. Well, 2013 and 2014 are interesting times for the media. When I met the Foreign Office spokesperson last year for a project where I was again doing, trying to research the influence of media in the India-China bilateral relationship, he told me, he was slightly pessimistic, and he said, look, you have 300 out of over 90,000 publications that actually look at foreign affairs. And if you really bring them down to small numbers, out of the 821 channels you have on air, there are only 5 channels which actually have any programming on foreign affairs. In fact, on English news networks, and since the study is basically focused on primarily on the English news network landscape, CNN, IBN, NDTV, Times now increasingly NewsX and Headlines Today. I'd like to tell you the only news show on foreign affairs called World 360, which was done by Suhasini Haidar, has also gone off air because now she's joined The Hindu, which is a print medium. So that's the kind of situation you're looking at. Also, foreign affairs coverage is myopic. If you ask people what stories click, goes for people both, I suppose, in the print and the television space. They'll tell you, you do a story in the United States, you do a story in Pakistan, and you do a story in China, it'll get both print and television news space. But anything, the rest of the composition, that's the interest in terms of the rest of the world, is basically 5% unless there is a crisis. We see that sort of change in 2014, at least perception-wise, with the historic election. Suddenly, the Prime Minister's neighborhood visits we have seen have got door-to-door exhaustive coverage, which was really not normal initially, and that can be validated by, suppose, prime time or news channels going 24/7 live coverage of the bilateral visit to Nepal or Bhutan also. I mean, we've never had that phenomenon where you would cut live and be on it the whole day, and news anchors, of course, asked to ad-lib over it ad nauseum. Only optics, not very much analysis, but nevertheless, that kind of attention is something which has been unprecedented. A lot of journalists say this doesn't mean that there is a spike in public interest in foreign policy. We have a popular government which has come to New Delhi after an era of coalition politics. There is also a prime minister who's known for his, oratorial style, his self-deprecative stance with the media. He's loved by the masses. He's also using the strategy of bypassing traditional media, basically speaking through public discourse on matters of foreign policy, as also giving a lot of attention to social media in terms of conducting mass media discourse. So, the MEA spokesperson now is quoted as saying that, it's great, the new government seems to have spiked the interest in foreign policy. You have a 400% increase in social media interest in matters of foreign policy with the new government. But then again, journalists say it's a honeymoon period. Some of them, of course, are cynical, and the others say that, well, till the Mr. Modi is in the frame, no matter what he's talking about is going to draw eyeballs. Now, I think it's also important to realize at this point of time that there is a case in point of strategic communication, which is suddenly, it's become far more cogent in the current setup. Last year, whenever issues broke out, you understood that because the government of the day was not particularly popular at that point of time, the backlash was very strong. You reverse the situation to now, where the government of the day is extremely popular. So there's a very strategic way of dealing with the media. First, prime ministers, all the international flights had, or international trips, had the whole private media contingent going. Now, the focus is primarily on the state media and state agencies. The leaks coming from within the government has stopped. So they're not very cleavages that the media is left to amplify, and hence the message, at least, as of now seems very cogent. So that basically brings you to the question of, it's a question one needs to ponder, that in such an environment where which it seems to be tritely managed, how much leeway does the media really have now to create the trouble that it has created in the past? Also, we have been speaking about beat reporting, especially with the MEA. In this case, when your source really is the government, and in this new context, when does national interest become jingoism or otherwise? Case in point is the LOC sort of tensions. If you compare it between 2013 and 2014, 2013, the primetime television networks and anchors were running after the government, talking about how weak its response was. In 2014, they're gunning after the opposition, telling them they're not aligning enough with the national interest. So it's really a matter of semantics. Also, it opens up the debate of how Indian media has covered and needs to cover national security and where that debate stands as of now. Now, that brings me quickly to the point of, I have isolated in my paper ideological and systemic challenges of what I think are hinder media's reportage on South Asia. Of course, we've already said that because of the construct of this entire debate and narrative around South Asia, we sort of come from already colored sort of prisms in which are on a majority, at least when we're talking about a medium like television, constructed on narrow national constructs, because, of course, there are histories of embitterment, historic baggage, we have conflicts which are live and active, and so the primary focus really of covering South Asia from within the Indian media has been the security threat paradigm. And you hardly ever find human interest stories, unless, of course, there's a tragedy of a very large scale, which then develops into, smaller stories to sustain the coverage. Second, of course, we have a permanent Pakistan obsession. Prime time, if foreign affairs or the neighborhood makes it to prime time, it's primarily Pakistan which gets the lion's share, and I don't think that needs to be, that is symptomatic, of course, of strategic realities and the nature of our relationship. However, I have to tell you that media's agency in the Indo-Pak relationship often is very different compared to its agency, suppose, in all other relationships, I would say, including China. In terms of Pakistan, the media almost takes it upon itself to assert its agency, depending, of course, upon public opinion, and has, over the period of time, we have seen through a lot of events, become the theater for proxy media wars. Now, I have to add a caveat here. I'm only speaking from the introspective sort of lens towards English news channels in India. I'm not making generalizations towards media outside. I thought, let me put that point up, really. Now, if you look, let's look at my frames of reference. For example, when I come into a news channel at the age of 20, right out of journalism school, I've grown up on coverage from 1999, which is the Kargil War. It was your first televised war. It was called the watershed in the militarization of the Indian mind. And I think a lot of us would agree that, especially in India, that, it's the first war where you remember the story of the Indian soldier. So body bags, even the recapture of Tiger Hill, you have Barkha. I've put up one of those grabs here. Barkha probably became the face and the phenomenon she was owing to the Kargil conflict. The televised war was appropriated, of course. I think this is where I say that media is often used by the government on all sides, especially in the subcontinent, to make its case at certain points of time. So it became almost a vehicle for whipping up national unity. Of course, the crisis was of such a magnitude that it required so. And these are images which have left an indelible mark on all our national psyche. And I think to work outside that frame of reference is going to be slightly difficult. Second, again, the 26/11 Mumbai attacks. I could tell you that as a cub reporter reporting from the ground at that point of time, a lot of times, because of the spectacle of the event, it was very difficult for a lot of journalists to remain objective. Of course, media at all points of time was criticized for its sensationalist coverage. It also was a very good example to show you how the media was exerting its agency and in fact actually got itself a role in terms of the deliberations between India and Pakistan. Case in point would be a quick example. You know, when the Pakistani terrorist Ajmal Kasab was captured, in the initial days, his identity was not confirmed, and it was alleged that Pakistan was not accepting him. Television channels, of course, after 26/11 were all gung-ho. They declared a war, and it was almost like India's 9/11. So every piece of investigation was being pieced together. CNN IBN rung up the then National Security Advisor, and over a phone interview, he accepted Kasab's nationality. Of course, in the larger scheme of things, that might not have been consequential, but at least perception-wise, television had handed New Delhi a diplomatic victory in the scheme of things and portrayed its importance in the India-Pakistan relationship. You also see that happening with Sharm el-Sheikh. It became, it is synonymous in sort of India circles as the Sharm el-Sheikh fiasco, because the Prime Minister, who was always, the then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who advocated the normalization of relations with Pakistan, actually made a comment which acknowledged in Pakistan's concerns of India's involvement in Baluchistan, and that had a very, very terrible blowback in India. What you saw was polarization of public opinion, sharpening of stance, and what happened is when he flew back in, he had to withdraw the statement, and the composite dialogue stood at a standstill. So media's agency in the Indo-Pak relationship is something unique. I think it requires, of course, a lot more understanding, but it also tells you how from time to time the media is appropriated in the national discourse and to legitimize views. Quickly coming to the next one, China. If we need to look at the neighborhood, the other view on prime time is to look at the China angle. It's the elephant in the room. Every angle of coverage, dwells on the unease with India's, dwells on India's unease rather, on, whether it is China's or whether friendship with Pakistan, the infrastructure forays into the neighborhood, trade agreements, etc. It's always through the lens of strategic competition. Hardly ever do you see that bilateral relations on their own qualify prime time with deep analysis or gains and losses of any bilateral relationship. That has, in fact, not even changed with the current dispensation in New Delhi. Most of all of the journalists said that, it was all, most of these bilateral relationships and their coverage were all about the optics. Of course, the previous speakers through the day have spoken about, the exceptions with Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka or West Bengal politics and Bangladesh, but that time the coverage was more domestic oriented rather than foreign policy. Finally, I have a lot of quotes in the paper. I don't have the time to read them out to you, where journalists have turned around and told me, well, it's all very easy for you to say that, we have to improve perceptions, but let me tell you, good neighborhood relations are not the mandate of the Indian media. You have to understand that we are thriving under extreme commercial considerations. We don't have people. If at all I go to my editor with a story, I might think it's important, it deserves front page, but he might reduce it to a tablet because there are other pressing concerns right now. So unless you can promise me readership and what is something called the search engine optimization, essentially, most columnists here would know, I get a lot of requests now to when I write a piece that I should, include words in the piece which would actually end up showing on internet search results. It's as driven to such an extent. So they said, you can expect objectivity from me, but please, we can't be the bearers of the mandate to improve perceptions for the neighborhood. Of course, systemic challenges, we've spoken about this through the day. Television especially, it becomes important because lack of access and visas become important because television thrives on images, and unlike print, which could deal with not having an image, television can't put a sustained coverage or story. That's at least the excuse most people like to use. But it's true. If you need to generate that interest in a particular story from a region, pictures become important, and usually visa regimes are a big problem. Journalists have also told me that, look, even if I wanted to go and even if visas come through, a lot of times I feel I'm on a patronage tour. Basically, if I get granted a visa, I can't do a very bad story because that might have repercussions. And since we are closely monitored, there's only so much you can do. However, there could be a separate angle and say that, you could have done a human interest story, but television only has time for conflict. Because that does generate a lot of viewership, and unfortunately, that's the ugly truth. We have also talked about how we have a complete lack of South Asia correspondents. I gave you figures previously in the slides, and if we have gotten reduced to having people in Beijing, the London and US, I don't think there's going to be enough space for putting up people in South Asia. Crisis coverage and competitive pressures, we've spoken about it. Over-dependence on advertising revenues, therefore sensationalist coverage. It's a vicious cycle and it continues. A lot of people tell me that television has become a prisoner of its own medium. Because of the episodic nature of your coverage, what happens is, even if a lot of people want to do analysis, the next big news or the next big story is only an ad break away. So a lot of times, you lose out on in-depth discussion and there's hardly any ground-up reporting. There is a very interesting study done by ICRIER on how underreporting in Indo-Pak trade has not helped normalization of relations in India and Pakistan. I mean, that's possible. It basically looks at Times of India, but that's possibly true for the whole neighborhood. When does one hear about trade being discussed on prime time? I don't think that's ever going to happen. Let me tell you out of experience that even if bilateral relationships are discussed, we have something called the national rap and the international rap. It is basically a 1-minute putting together of 10 stories from around the world. That's possibly where a story of bilateral trade would go, and that's the way how things work. The last point is, a lot of people were talking about, the expectations from social media and the online world to sort of help improving perception. But it also tells you that despite having the abundance of resources on the internet, our perceptions in terms of attitudes towards each other haven't really seen a profound change. Of course, you can always argue that, social media can be manipulated and particular points of view are amplified. On a paper without being vetted by a journalist actually go on prime time without any filters because they've acquired the popularity they have in social media. In fact, Nitin Gokhale is going to be here tomorrow. He and I have had discussions on this quite a lot, and he's also written a piece about how during the LOC tensions flare up last year, it was the social media that actually broke the story on his Twitter handle, and how within 15 minutes there was absolute pressure and mayhem from a lot of people who tweeted to him saying that, this is y'all are not reporting on a story, you're trying to cover it up. And before there was even verification that could be done by NDTV, the pressure on mainstream media to put the story out was growing by the minute. Okay, so I come to our last slide. Where do we go from here? I mean, we've had some great ideas being spoken about today, but I think we're all off the consensus that there are no instant solutions. Media is but one actor in the process of foreign policy formulation, and while there is introspection on the role of sensationalist media and how they have to have more responsibility, it will always reflect strategic realities. And so anybody who blames the media or shoots the messenger will often be accused of not really having their policy together to give the media the amount of space to create that kind of trouble. One also has to recognize that you cannot overall narratives that have formed over a period of time. You have frames of references which have been reinforced from generation to generation, and that is a tough sort of discourse to overhaul. However, you can suppose and hope the media does help break the stereotypes, but that again brings us back to the business model Mr. Sharma was talking about, as to how the media will actually be only forced to look at news stories and avenues when they decide that making money from advertising is not the only way to keep themselves alive. Finally, all the other suggestions we've discussed them, and I'm going to leave it for you to read. But we have, I think, in India, really felt the need for a public service broadcaster like the BBC to come into the electronic media space, because even though a lot of people here have told me time and again that when they go to Lok Sabha TV or Rajya Sabha TV, the quality of the discussions is very good. Unfortunately, though, that they don't have the kind of traction among the public, and that's a question we all need to investigate. Why does that happen despite having great content? One argument might be that state media often looked upon as propaganda tools of the government. Until you can shake up that image and sort of revamp the way it's seen, that you're always going to feel that conspicuously. I think I would like to end by saying there is evidence of introspection and realization among certain sections of the Indian electronic media that they need to inform and overcome the crisis of credibility, because that seems to be the overarching accusation among them. I thought I'd leave you with a quote from Karan Thapa, who I think perhaps in the scheme of things is the most moderate of television debate anchors in the country right now. And he says that, good discussions will happen if channel heads of various channels accept that current affair discussions are not mass audience programs and must not be thought of as entertainment. Therefore, those who care and want to know, and this group will always be a minority. Now, if this comes up against the imperatives of commercial survival, that is a conundrum our television producers must address and solve. I accept it won't be easy. In fact, it would be expensive both in terms of money and audience. But if it doesn't happen, television discussions will soon cease to matter, except in a negative sense. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience. I hope I've kept most of you awake. Thank you again. Thank you.